Jessica Owens had spent years building a perfect life, wealth, success, and a pristine reputation. But when she was found dead in her own home, the story that emerged was anything but perfect. Detective Mark Harris, initially convinced that Jessica had been a victim, soon uncovered a chilling truth. The woman everyone thought was murdered had staged it all. As he dug deeper, he discovered that Jessica's trusted assistant, Sarah Jensen, wasn't just an innocent bystander. She was the one who pulled the trigger. But why? What dark secrets had they been hiding? And how far was Sarah willing to go to seize everything Jessica had worked for? The night air was crisp and still as the phone rang, its shrill sound breaking the silence of the small town of Westbrook. At 3 a.m., there wasn't a single soul awake, but the call was urgent. The dispatcher reported a scene of violence at a luxurious home on the outskirts of town. Detective Mark Harris grabbed his jacket, slinging it over his shoulders as he rushed out of his apartment. He knew this wasn't going to be just another routine case. When Harris arrived at the scene, the house stood like an eerie monument, isolated and dark against the backdrop of towering trees. He walked up the stone path to the front door, where a team of officers had already secured the area. Inside, the scene was unsettling. The living room was disheveled, with overturned furniture and broken glass scattered across the floor. A vase, once elegant, lay shattered near the fireplace, its contents spilled like the remnants of a forgotten life. At the center of the chaos lay Jessica Owens, a young woman in her early 30s. Her body was stretched out on the floor, her eyes staring lifelessly at the ceiling. It wasn't the image of a typical victim. The struggle marks on her body suggested she had fought back, clawed at her attacker, possibly even dragged herself across the floor. Yet, her face didn't show the usual fear or shock. It was eerily serene, almost as though she had resigned herself to her fate. The bloodstains were smudged on the floor as if she had tried to pull herself toward something, though nothing was clear. Harris scanned the room, his instincts telling him that this wasn't just a random act of violence. Something felt off, like a puzzle with a missing piece. There was no sign of forced entry, and nothing appeared to be stolen. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than met the eye. Detective Harris stood in the middle of the disarrayed living room, absorbing every detail. His team had cordoned off the house, but every inch of the space seemed to whisper a story, and none of it made sense. The blood, the broken furniture, Jessica's lifeless body, none of it pointed to a simple robbery gone wrong. He had seen enough crime scenes to know when something didn't add up, and this was one of those times. After confirming that the body was indeed Jessica Owens, Harris turned his attention to her husband, Tom, who had been waiting outside. He was pacing nervously, his face pale, eyes red-rimmed with tears. His clothes, still sharp from what appeared to be a business meeting, were slightly wrinkled, and his hair looked as though it had been hastily run through. It was clear that the police hadn't yet told him the full extent of the situation. He looked like a man in shock, the kind who was struggling to understand how his world had just crumbled. Tom explained that he had been at a dinner meeting in the city when he received the call. He rushed home immediately, arriving to find his wife already gone. He had no idea who could have done this to her. There was no indication of any trouble, he said, and their life had seemed picture perfect. They had no enemies, no financial strain, nothing that could explain such a brutal attack. His voice cracked as he described their life together, but Harris couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. Tom's story seemed too rehearsed, too perfect. He wanted to believe the man, but the detective's gut told him to dig deeper. As Harris left Tom with officers, he cast a final look at the scene. The strange blood patterns, the quiet house. It felt as though Jessica had been the target, but also somehow the instigator. There was more here than a simple murder. Harris just had to uncover what it was. Days passed, and the investigation into Jessica Owens' death became more tangled with every new piece of evidence. Detective Harris dug through Jessica's life with a fine-tooth comb, trying to make sense of the oddities he had encountered at the crime scene. What stood out most was the quiet, unsettling sense of emptiness in Jessica's life. On the surface, she had everything: a successful business, a charitable reputation, and a seemingly perfect marriage. But the deeper Harris looked, the more cracks began to appear in her glossy exterior. The breakthrough came when he discovered Jessica's private journal. The pages, filled with hurried handwriting, detailed a life far more complicated than anyone had realized. In her entries, Jessica spoke of fear and paranoia, of feeling watched and threatened by an unknown person. The messages were cryptic, but one name stood out repeatedly: Kay. At first, Harris dismissed it as some kind of code or nickname, but, as he continued to read, the tone of the entries grew darker. She was terrified of Kay, someone she believed was coming for her. The final entry was particularly chilling. Jessica wrote, "If something happens to me, it was him. I'm not safe anymore." Harris couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. Who was this person? Why hadn't anyone mentioned Kay before? The investigation had focused so heavily on Tom Owens, but there were no signs that he was involved in any way, and nothing in the house suggested a personal vendetta against Jessica. It didn't make sense that someone would want her dead for no reason, but Kay seemed to be the missing piece, the shadow lurking behind her perfect life. Determined to find answers, Harris had the journal analyzed for any clues that could lead to the identity of Kay. The detective now realized that Jessica's life had been far from the straightforward success story it had appeared to be. She had been hiding something, and whatever it was had finally caught up with her. As Detective Harris delved deeper into Jessica Owens's past, he uncovered a series of troubling revelations that painted an entirely different picture of her life. The more he uncovered, the more it became clear that Jessica had been far from the perfect philanthropist she appeared to be. Behind the carefully crafted public persona, there were signs of darker dealings. One of the most significant discoveries was Jessica's involvement in a controversial real estate venture a few years prior. The deal had seemed promising at first, a multi-million-dollar investment in a new development project, but it had quickly soured. Harris found documents detailing the project's collapse, along with a number of lawsuits filed by angry investors who had lost large sums of money. As he read through the records, it became clear that Jessica had been at the center of the controversy, and she appeared to have manipulated the situation to her advantage. The more Harris investigated, the more he learned about Jessica's role in the shady business practices. She had promised returns on investments that never materialized, using her charm and reputation to attract investors who trusted her blindly. When the project failed, many of those investors were left with nothing. Some had even gone bankrupt, but Jessica had managed to walk away from the mess unscathed, her name untarnished in the public eye. However, as Harris dug further, he found whispers of people who had been left behind, people who had lost everything and had been desperate to find some kind of justice. Harris began to suspect that these former investors, many of whom had been ruined by Jessica's actions, might hold the key to her murder. It wasn't just a random act of violence. Jessica had likely made enemies, and one of them, it seemed, had finally decided to take matters into their own hands. Harris couldn't help but wonder, had Jessica's perfect life been nothing more than a facade to cover up a history of betrayal and deception? As the investigation into Jessica Owens' death continued, Detective Harris stumbled upon a crucial lead that added a new layer of complexity to the case. Lucas Grant, a former business associate of Jessica's, had disappeared around the same time she was murdered. Harris had already come across Lucas's name during his investigation into the failed real estate venture, but until now, the connection had seemed incidental. Now, it felt like a missing puzzle piece, one that might hold the key to understanding what had truly happened. Lucas had been deeply involved in the real estate project, and as Harris dug deeper into his background, it became clear that their partnership had soured. According to former colleagues, Lucas had begun to suspect that Jessica had been involved in fraudulent activities and was quietly gathering evidence to expose her. He had even hinted to a few people that he was preparing to go public with what he knew. But as the weeks passed, Lucas vanished without a trace. His disappearance had been brushed off as a personal choice, but now, in light of Jessica's murder, it seemed far more significant. Harris began to dig into Lucas's last known whereabouts. His apartment had been abandoned, and his phone records showed no communication after the day he disappeared. Yet, In his search of Lucas's apartment, Harris found something unexpected. A folder filled with documents and photographs detailing Jessica's involvement in the real estate scam. The evidence was damning. There were contracts, financial statements, and even personal notes from Jessica herself, outlining plans to mislead investors and cover up the project's failure. Harris realized that Lucas had been trying to protect those who had been swindled by Jessica, and that his disappearance wasn't just a coincidence. It seemed likely that Lucas had uncovered enough to destroy Jessica's carefully constructed world, and had paid the price for it. But the question remained. Had Jessica killed him to protect herself, or had someone else silenced him before he could expose her? And if Lucas was a target, was it possible that the same person responsible for his disappearance was also behind Jessica's murder? Detective Harris couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the case than he had initially realized. The disappearance of Lucas Grant had started to feel less like an isolated incident and more like a critical piece of the puzzle. As he pieced together the evidence from Lucas's apartment, Harris's suspicions only deepened. It was clear that Lucas had been on the verge of exposing Jessica Owens for the fraudulent real estate schemes that had ruined so many lives. The question now was whether Jessica had played a direct role in Lucas's disappearance, and if so, how much of it was linked to her own death. Harris reached out to the victims of Jessica's real estate fraud, those whose lives had been destroyed by the failed project. Many of them were still living in financial ruin, their hopes for recovery dashed. One by one, they painted a picture of Jessica as a woman who was both charismatic and manipulative, a master at masking her true intentions. The more he heard, the more Harris understood that Jessica had used her charm to convince people to trust her, only to betray them when they were most vulnerable. One investor, a woman named Diane Simmons, had been particularly vocal in the aftermath of the project's collapse. She had lost her life savings and it had shattered her. Diane revealed that she had confronted Jessica shortly before her death, demanding to know why she had allowed so many people to suffer. According to Diane, Jessica had been calm and almost cold, as though she had expected the confrontation. But it wasn't just her actions that raised suspicion. It was the way she had responded to threats. Diane remembered Jessica saying, "If you think you can expose me, you're making a huge mistake. You don't know who you're dealing with." That statement haunted Harris. It seemed as though Jessica had known there would be consequences. But had she been the one to silence Lucas, or had someone else decided to step in, using her own actions as a cover? Harris couldn't ignore the growing possibility that Jessica's murder was a calculated move, not just to protect herself, but to prevent something far more damaging from coming to light. He was closer than ever to understanding the true motive behind her death, but the answers were still eluding him. As Detective Harris continued his investigation, he began to notice a pattern that made him uncomfortable. The more he uncovered, the more it seemed that Jessica Owens had been operating in a world where truth and deception were carefully woven together. What initially appeared to be a simple case of a woman murdered by a disgruntled investor was slowly transforming into something much more complex and potentially more dangerous. Harris started to turn his attention to those closest to Jessica, particularly her inner circle. He had already interviewed her husband, Tom Owens, but something about his story continued to bother him. Tom's grief seemed genuine, but there was a coldness to his reactions that Harris couldn't shake. When pressed further about their financial situation, Tom had quickly deflected, claiming there were no issues. Yet Jessica's business dealings told a different story. It wasn't just the failed real estate project. There were whispers of other investments gone bad, of debts piling up. Tom had access to the same financial records that Jessica had, and he would have known about the potential fallout from her actions. But it wasn't just Tom that raised suspicions. Harris learned that some of the local law enforcement officers who had worked with Jessica were also involved in her business ventures. It was subtle at first, a few casual connections here and there, but as Harris dug deeper, he uncovered a troubling web of influence. Certain officers had helped smooth over legal problems for Jessica in the past, and others had participated in questionable dealings to protect her reputation. The more Harris investigated, the more it became clear that Jessica had cultivated a network of people, both in the business world and within the police force, who had helped keep her darker secrets hidden. It was becoming harder for Harris to trust anyone. The case wasn't just about Jessica anymore. It was about a community built on secrets, where the line between good and bad was blurred. As he dug deeper into these connections, he realized that Jessica's murder might have been just the tip of the iceberg. What if someone within her own circle had decided that the only way to protect themselves and their interests was to permanently silence her? The detective was now on the verge of uncovering a much larger conspiracy, one that might involve more than just Jessica's death. The closer he got, the more dangerous it became. The breakthrough Harris had been waiting for came when he reviewed the surveillance footage from the security cameras in Jessica's house. It had been overlooked initially, as it seemed like an afterthought in the chaos of the investigation. But as Harris rewatched the footage, something in the footage stood out that sent a chill through him. At first glance, it seemed like standard footage of a woman entering her home, preparing for the night ahead. Jessica, wearing a loose sweater and jeans, appeared calm and unbothered as she walked through the front door around 7 p.m. But as the footage played out, the mood shifted when she entered the living room. Jessica was carrying a knife, a large, gleaming chef's knife, which seemed odd for a woman returning home after a long day. She didn't appear startled, nor was she acting like a victim. Instead, she held it in her hand as though she was preparing for something, walking purposefully toward the center of the room. The camera angle showed her pacing slightly, as if waiting for someone. Harris froze the footage and leaned in, his breath catching. Then a shadow appeared in the doorway. An intruder, or so it seemed at first. But something about Jessica's body language didn't fit the image of a woman who was trying to escape or defend herself. She didn't panic. Instead, she positioned herself as though expecting a confrontation. As the figure in the doorway stepped forward, Jessica didn't retreat. She stepped toward the intruder, her posture still calm, almost like she was guiding him into the room. In that moment, Harris realized the truth. Jessica hadn't been the helpless victim of a crime. She had staged her own death. The bloodstains on the floor weren't from an attacker. They were from Jessica herself. She had dragged herself to the position she was found in, creating a scene to make it look like a violent attack. But why? What was the purpose of orchestrating her own murder? Harris's mind raced. Could it be that Jessica had set up her own death to escape her financial ruin, or to cover up the scandalous truth of her business dealings? The camera footage held the answer, and Jessica's role in her own demise was now undeniable. But the question remained, who had really killed her? Was it someone who had caught on to her plot? Or had Jessica been manipulating the situation all along to make her death look like something it wasn't? As Detective Harris pieced together the fragmented evidence, a startling realization began to form. The more he watched Jessica Owens' security footage, the more it became clear that her death had been meticulously planned. She hadn't been a victim. She had orchestrated everything to appear as though someone else had killed her. The blood, the struggle, the signs of violence. It was all a ruse. Jessica had staged her death as part of a larger scheme. But why? What had driven her to go so far? Harris returned to the initial crime scene with a fresh perspective, carefully re-examining every detail. The broken furniture, the shattered vase. It now made sense. Jessica had staged the struggle, making it look as though she had fought for her life. The drag marks on the floor, the bloodstains, everything was carefully placed to suggest a violent confrontation. She had made sure that anyone investigating would believe a brutal attacker had entered her home, leaving behind chaos and confusion. But now, knowing what he did, Harris could see the truth. It was all staged. The motive, however, remained elusive. Jessica hadn't just been running from a failed business or mounting debts. The more Harris thought about her life, the people she had betrayed, the lies she had told, the more he began to suspect that her plan was not just about escaping her past. Jessica had been planning something bigger, something that required her to disappear entirely. And then it hit him. What if she hadn't been running from her creditors or a disgruntled ex-partner? What if Jessica had staged her death to escape from something far darker, something that could destroy not just her but everyone around her? Perhaps she had realized that the people she had manipulated and deceived over the years were finally catching up to her, and she knew that she wouldn't survive once they did. But there was still one question left. Who was the person who had actually killed her? Harris couldn't shake the feeling that there was a hidden player in this twisted drama. Someone who had discovered Jessica's secret, and in the process, had taken matters into their own hands. As the detective stood in the empty living room, he realized that the answers were closer than ever, but the final piece was still just out of reach. The investigation had reached a boiling point. Detective Harris had pieced together most of the puzzle, but the final layer still eluded him. The shocking truth he was uncovering was dark and complex, and it revolved around one question. Who truly killed Jessica Owens? Her death, staged as a brutal murder, had been carefully planned. But now Harris was realizing that the answer wasn't just in who committed the crime, but in why it had been done in the first place. As Harris continued to dig into Sarah Jensen's background, a pattern of manipulation began to form. Sarah had been a silent observer, watching Jessica's rise and fall. But now Harris saw that she wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She had been an active participant in Jessica's deceit. While it was clear that Sarah had been involved in covering up Jessica's financial schemes, the real revelation came when Harris looked deeper into Sarah's connection with Lucas Grant. Lucas, it turned out, had been more than just a disgruntled business partner. He had been romantically involved with Sarah for months before his disappearance. She had confided in him about Jessica's plans, her schemes, and her intentions to fake her own death. In a fit of rage, after learning about Jessica's betrayal and financial manipulations, Lucas had confronted her, demanding the truth. According to a witness, that confrontation had turned violent. But what no one knew was that Sarah had been there too. It wasn't just that Sarah had helped Lucas disappear. It was that she had been the one to pull the trigger. She had been the one to end Jessica's life. But in a twisted turn of events, she had also become her accomplice in staging the scene. Jessica had planned everything meticulously, but Sarah was the one who finished what had started, executing the final act in the deadly charade. As Harris pieced this together, he realized that the motive was more than just revenge. It was about control. Control over the narrative. Control over their lives. Sarah had killed Jessica to take over the very life Jessica had built. Her motives weren't driven by hate alone. They were driven by a deep desire to seize the life Jessica had created for herself, the wealth, the power, and the ability to manipulate people for her own gain. Harris stood there, stunned by the truth that had just unraveled. Sarah Jensen, the quiet assistant, was the mastermind behind Jessica Owens' death, and it was her ambition and greed that had ultimately led to this tragic end. What was supposed to be a perfect escape had become a deadly trap. And Harris finally understood that the real killer had been hiding in plain sight all along.